Welcome to the study of antiquity in the Middle Ages. I'm D.W. Draffin, and here we are in the land of the Pueblo. Ancestral Puebloans. Produced by D.W. Draffin. According to researchers, modern humans have lived in the Americas for at least 16,000 years, while other lines of evidence push the date back even further. A possible site in Monteverde, Chile, may be from 18,500 years ago. Recently discovered footprints in New Mexico indicate humans may have crossed their mudflats up to 23,000 years ago. These finds remain heavily contested, and nobody would yet consider them conclusive. So archaeologists and archaeogeneticists continue to gather new evidence about the peopling of the Americas, adding more and more data to our understanding. But who exactly were these ancestral people? We know Paleo-Indians by their genetic lineages, how they most closely preserved haplogroups found in Central Asia 26,000 years ago, such as patrilineal Q haplotypes, which are present in over 90% of modern Amerindians. We've learned a bit about their unique mutations, some of which are most likely the result of a 5,000-year Ice Age pause in their migration across ancient Beringia. We've begun to find archaeological and paleogenomic evidence of their progenitors in Siberia and Alaska and the Yukon. But what did they look like? What did they believe? How did they live their daily lives? In so many regions across the Americas, these ancient ones are remembered in oral histories. Tribes and nations that have lived on their land for 1,000 years or more will still often describe those who came before. For example, the largest Native American nation today in the United States is the Navajo Nation of the Southwest. Although they seem ancient to those of us who came after, they are relatively recent migrants to the desert. As the southernmost speakers of the Na-Dene Athabascan family of languages, their origins were the southern coast of Alaska over 600 years ago. They crossed the continent over generations and arrived at a momentous time in the desert, a time of great changes. Or perhaps they themselves were the cause of the great changes. But the people they encountered, who were already there, they named the Anasazi, the Ancient Ones, or the Ancient Enemy. It is a name the descendants of these Ancient Ones do not like. It turns them into the other, an ethnicity that sounds at the same time both dangerous and extinct. When the Spaniards arrived 200 years later, they called these same Ancient Ones the people of the Pueblo, or village. Hidden in canyons or atop mesas, their stone and adobe clay villages remain the wonders of the region. The Ancient Ones, from whom the 100 active Pueblo villages, towns, and councils are directly descended, we call the Ancestral Puebloans. Here exist a number of living, vibrant communities who also happen to be some of the only examples of the Old Ones who have remained in their original region anywhere in the Americas. The Pueblo lands of the Hopi and many others are remote and entirely surrounded by the Navajo Nation. For outsiders, it is easy for them to remain hidden under layers of other dominant societies, but learning the details of their culture, which has arguably been consistently developed over nearly 11,000 years, opens an immense world. The beginning. Going back to the initial peopling of the Americas, the dominant narrative regarding the expansion of peoples across the Beringian land bridge has them accessing an ice-free corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets through western Canada around 16,000 years ago. Assuming this model is correct, These first people hunted Paleolithic megafauna across North America as the Ice Age finally came to a close, around 12,000 years ago. Expanding southward, the Paleo-Indians who decided to remain in the region now commonly referred to as Four Corners, or the corners where the states of Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico join, are perhaps less than 1,000 years off the timeline of those who claim direct descent from the Ancestral Puebloans. Or, perhaps, the 23,000-year-old footprints in New Mexico are authentic, in which case the hypothesis of the Kelp Highway might be bolstered, that seafaring people were not trapped by the glaciers and ice sheets of Beringia, but instead had free passage up and down the west coast of the Americas during pauses in the ice ages over millennia. In this scenario, settlements along the coast would eventually give rise to stable populations that would set out to explore and settle the interior. But such a scenario requires archaeological proof of such settlements, and sea levels have risen up to 100 meters above where such remains would be located. So apart from these footprints in the distant interior and some tantalizing mitochondrial DNA evidence, the Kelp Highway remains a highly contested hypothesis. Material evidence is scant for Paleo-Indian peoples. The archaeologist Cynthia Irwin Williams excavated many of their sites of the American Southwest in the 1950s and coined the term the Picosa culture for the very earliest of the finds they discovered. Picosa is a portmanteau of P for the Pinto Basin that stretches throughout much of the American West and whose oldest finds date to circa 7000 BCE. Co for the Cochise tradition, which is the earliest identified cultural tradition in the American Southwest, originating circa 5000 BCE, and Sa for the San Pedro, the next tradition that began around 1500 BCE. These Amerindians inhabited what was known as the Archaic Age of Native Americans. It is the umbrella term for the era in the Americas that began with the end of the last ice age and the beginning of a much warmer and wetter world. The Archaic peoples distinguished themselves from the Paleo-Indians who came before by new developments in stone tools, hunting strategies, and construction of permanent structures. From the base of Navajo Mountain, atlatls and darts and stone-tipped spears from circa 8000 BCE have been found. These were used to hunt everything from rabbits to antelope to bighorn sheep. One-handed manos, or crushing stones, have been recovered from this era, as well as wide and flat slab metates, showing that maize and other grasses were crushed before being eaten, indicating a level of agriculture among the Archaics that the mostly nomadic Paleo-Indians did not possess. Also, unifacial scrapers used for skinning animals allowed for more efficient harvesting of protein-dense game. These early Picosa peoples eventually grew into a culture that Irwin Williams identified as the Oshara tradition. Throughout the 1960s, in a site in northwestern New Mexico known as Arroyo Cuervo, the pioneering female archaeologist and her team uncovered layer upon layer of finds, the earliest of which date to nearly 10,600 years ago. These findings remain disputed, but those who lay claim to 11,000 years of uninterrupted culture among the Pueblo peoples point to it as one of their lines of evidence. The phases of the Oshara tradition, which occurred primarily in the eastern half of the Four Corners region, have been broken down according to the continuing development of different stone points. The oldest is the J phase, which began nearly 8,000 years ago. What we know of these people is that they grew increasingly sedentary and lived near canyon heads, hunting nearby game and gathering nearby plants, using the manos and metates to soften the tough grasses they ate. Next, the Bajada phase began nearly 7,000 years ago, which provides clear use of hearths and ovens, as well as distinctly different types of stone points. Concurrently, in different sites, They named the San Jose phase for yet different styles of stone tools as well as larger settlements that have left trash and midden heaps. Following both of these phases was the Armijo phase, beginning nearly 4,000 years ago. Known as the Middle Archaic, this is when the historical record provides clear evidence of the cultivation of maize. This led to a new type of site, most likely used for storing maize, which could be visited by up to 50 people on a seasonal basis. The spear blades they formed during this period were shorter, and evolved at the end of the phase to include stems and serrated edges. Nearly 3,000 years ago, the El Medio phase began, also known as the Archaic phase of the southwestern basket weaver culture. Now people have migrated to the base of cliffs, begun weaving baskets and using underground storage pits, and proliferated widely over the area. Finally, in the Trujillo phase, around 1,500 years ago, ceramic pottery was first introduced. This pottery is now one of the most widely known and iconic cultural traditions of the greater Pueblo cultures. As the people grew more sedentary and less nomadic, their structures grew more complex. The Ancestral Puebloan village, as it is now known, was a collective structure built of loose stone, or later adobe, that was occupied by several dozen or more related families. It would have a plaza where the people could meet, and many cool, dark rooms which would protect them from the blazing sun or warm them during frigid desert nights. Woven tapestries and rugs would cover the cold walls and floors. Ladders of pinyon or lodgepole pine would be hauled up during the night to protect from raids. Sources of water were never too far away. Edible plants such as wild grape, serviceberry, elderberry, yucca, amaranth, and black walnut were prepared and eaten fresh, and also cooked and stored. The game animals ranged seasonally and geographically from mice and fish and songbirds to rabbits to antelope and bear and bighorn sheep. The setting. The region where all this occurred is known as the Colorado Plateau, a massive watershed that now drains the Colorado River from the Rocky Mountains highlands through the Grand Canyon to the Sea of Cortez. The word Colorado is Spanish for red-colored, evoking the landscape of stunning red rocks, ancient sandstone deposits rich with iron and manganese. The high desert is covered with scrub brush and cacti and generally open to the horizon 100 miles in every direction. It is a land of great skies, powerful winds, and dangerous flash floods. To walk across the exposed landscape immediately makes one prioritize shelter from the wind and sun, the nighttime cold, or the daytime heat. And shelter is more available than it first seems. The desert isn't nearly as flat as it looks. Floods carve channels and canyons throughout, many of which can't be seen until they are directly underfoot. So it becomes a maze of animals, plants, and people hiding in plain sight, cultivating luxurious oases of life in the nooks and crannies of the high plateau. For example, the iconic Mesa Verde National Park and cliff dwellings contain a huge wealth of Paleo-Indian sites. Evidence of human habitation here begins around 9600 BCE at the advent of the Archaic era, called the Foothills Mountain Complex. Following glacial drainage rivers from north to south, the ancestors of the Ancestral Puebloans settled in the Colorado Plateau as the world warmed and the megafauna they hunted began to disappear. With the loss of big game and a more stable climate, settlements in Mesa Verde appear by 7500 BCE. After another 1,500 years passed, these seasonal camps became more permanent caves and rock shelters, and the evidence of more complex social structures, including trade, occurs at this time. A period of major temperature swings from nearly 7,000 to 4,000 years ago may have contributed to the increased population density of this region, The Colorado Plateau has a relatively high altitude, and its rivers would have been fed by snowmelt when lower desert regions went dry. The context. Surrounding the ancestral Puebloans were other groups at this time. The Mogollon culture was further south and east, lasting for over 1,000 years and rising to prominence in the 2nd century CE. They were eventually pushed out by other groups and replaced by the Apache. Their remnants may have been absorbed by Hopi, Zuni, and Acoma settlements. To the southwest, in the region of modern-day Phoenix, the Hohokam flourished during the same period as the Mogollon. Their canal networks are the most complex waterways discovered in the pre-contact Americas. Trade networks crisscrossed the region, bringing many immigrants into Hohokam lands and diversifying their populations. To the west, the lowland Patayan peoples dwelled, also called the Hakataya culture, forming a connection to the peoples of the California coast. The Pecos classification is an attempt to identify and divide the eras of the ancestral Puebloans into phases that are defined by changes in architecture, textiles and wall art and pottery, and cultural traditions. It initially identified a basket maker I period, which is now known as the Archaic or Oshara tradition. Now it picks up where the Oshara classifications leave off. Beginning around 1500 BCE, in the early basket maker II era, most ancestral Puebloans are believed to still be camping in the open for most of the year and seasonally occupying caves when needed. The introduction of persistent maize and squash gardens appears, and the stone tools used to grind and prepare their cornmeal grow more sophisticated. Yet these changes didn't come about in lockstep throughout the region. The Mogollon ancestors of New Mexico's Puebloans had settled down and cultivated maize long before the Hopi's ancestors, whom the Hopi refer to as the Hizhatzanom. These people roamed the Colorado Plateau, hunting and gathering, but also interacting with and learning from many other tribes and peoples. By the late basket maker II era, shamans had emerged and a developed religion appeared. Beginning around 50 CE, pit houses began to proliferate in the region as settlements grew more developed. Storage bins and cists allowed food supplies to be stored through the lean seasons. A vast array of artifacts from this era have been discovered, including baskets and bags woven from yucca fibers, feather and fur robes and blankets, bone-stitching awls, whistles, pipes, gaming pieces, and oval-shaped cradles. This distinct culture persisted until about 500 CE. Afterward came the basket maker III era. The pit houses became larger and more communal, and for the first time the bow and arrow replaced the atlatl and spear. Also, due to increased trade with the cultures of Mexico, beans make their first appearance here alongside squash and maize, forming the iconic and widely adopted Three Sisters system of companion planting. A small hill is seeded with maize, whose stalks serve as a trellis for the climbing beans. The beans return the favor by providing stability in high winds and by fixing nitrogen in the soil for the benefits of all the plant's roots, and the squash have broad leaves which shade the ground, keeping it moist and suppressing weeds. The Ancestral Pueblos. As well as distinguishing these people along a time scale, it is also necessary to distinguish them according to their geographical distribution. The peoples of the Pueblo today can be found in 100 different communities across the Southwest. Many continue to live in ancient villages atop mesas, as the Hopi or the Acoma do. Others have been abandoned and fallen into ruins that can be found in canyons, such as in Canyon de Che or Mesa Verde, or placed beside streams such as the ruins of Puerco Pueblo. Also, the flora and fauna of California's Mojave, which forms the barrier to the west, is dramatically different from the Uintas Mountains of Utah or the bottom of the Grand Canyon. But regardless of where they lived, the Pueblo people shared a unified culture, religion, and trade network. The sheer number and variety of the ancient ruins throughout the Four Corners region and the Colorado Plateau is astounding. Researchers can spend their entire careers characterizing a single site, digging down through layers that are often millennia old. Petroglyphs have been etched into the dark stone, and pictographs have been painted seemingly everywhere, on canyon walls and fallen boulders in the high desert, a written record that tells the story of an eventful past. Mesa Verde is the most well-known, for good reason. Its setting is remarkable, and the society its inhabitants constructed is among the most unique of any of its type. Mug House, one of their largest complexes, possesses 94 rooms and may have housed up to 100 people. Chaco Canyon was the setting of the great complex known as Pueblo Bonito. Multi-story great houses throughout the site and a network of major roads connecting its settlements attest to its claim as the capital of ancestral Puebloan culture. Hovenweep in southwestern Colorado was the home to 6 villages, with archaeological evidence of human habitation going back a full 10,000 years. Chimney Rock, Walnut Canyon, Jemez, Canyon of the Ancients, Canyon de Chelly, and the misnamed Aztec Ruins National Monument are among the many other notable sites which are simply too numerous to list. Linguistics. The languages of the Puebloans are generally broken down into 2 families, Tanoan and Keresan. The Tanoan languages are part of the larger Kiowa-Tanoan language family spoken among native cultures from Oklahoma and Texas in the east to the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico. Divided into subgroups of Towa, spoken at Jemez Pueblo, Tiwa, spoken at Taos and Sandia, and Tewa, spoken most widely at San Ildefonso and many others. Keresan, or the Keres languages, are only spoken among the Pueblo peoples, with variations ranging from Acoma to Laguna to San Felipe. 2 other major language families are also represented, but only on specific pueblos. The Zuni speak their own language isolate, and the Hopi speak a type of Uto-Aztecan dialect, which is a language family that can be found throughout Mexico, including the Aztec Empire, stretching north throughout the American West. Such mixing of language illustrates the degree of contact between the nations and cultures of the archaic Southwest. They positioned themselves, perhaps unknowingly, at a crucial crossroads of the continent. As settlers of European descent learned to their dismay in the 19th century, traversing the continental United States is one nearly impossible challenge after another. Fording the Mississippi, climbing the Rockies, surviving the desert, then, just when it appears that the desert is done, the eastern wall of the Sierra rises like an impassable wall in precipitous peaks with deadly high mountain passes that can only be traversed in the summer. Only by staying to the south and navigating the lower mountains of the Southwest through the Colorado River and the Mojave Desert can one easily access the interior valleys and coast of California. So the Hohokam and Ancestral Puebloans found themselves the geographic contact point between the great cultures of the Mesoamerican heartland to the south, the Great Plains tribes to the north, and the California cultures to the west. These influences can be found in their languages, their food, such as the advent of beans from Central America, and in their cultures and religions. Genetics. It would be simplistic to say a modern Pueblo person is identical to ancestral Puebloans, yet a 2010 study in the Journal of Archaeological Science, which analyzed 48 remains in the Tommy and Mine Canyon sites of central New Mexico, helped to refine earlier studies that did exactly that, proving that modern occupants of the region are, in fact, genetically similar to samples as much as 1,000 years old, which argues for an uninterrupted settlement of these people over that period. But the 2010 study went even further, noting mitochondrial DNA haplogroup frequencies in the Southwest are typified by high levels of haplogroup B, moderate frequencies of haplogroup C, and relatively low frequencies of haplogroups A, D, and X. And haplogroup frequencies of Native American populations of Mesoamerica are equally distinctive, but haplogroup A is most common and haplogroup B is relatively rare, suggesting different ancestry and/or population histories for the two geographic regions. Interestingly, the populations of northern Mexico, such as the Tarahumara, Cora, and Huichol, exhibit intermediate frequencies of both haplogroups A and B, suggesting a cline incorporating the Southwest and Mesoamerica that might have resulted from gene flow between the two areas. The ubiquitous Native American Q haplogroup is rare in the Southwest, indicating that there may be another source for the origin of the archaic peoples of the region. The ubiquitous Native American Q lineages can be traced 26,000 years ago to Central Asia, and they chart the progress of migrating founder populations from west to east and across the Beringian land bridge. But those with dominant A and B haplotypes most likely arrived from later waves of migration, perhaps along the coastal Kelp Highway, although possible links between Polynesian and South American and Mesoamerican archaic populations remain highly theoretical and unsupported by the wider archaeological community. The culture. A number of monographs and memoirs from the late 19th century and early 20th century exist depicting what Pueblo life was like for the modern descendants of the ancestral Puebloans. Although it is incorrect to say that any modern group act just as their ancestors do, many beliefs and traditions have been preserved among these communities. Here are selected excerpts from The Unwritten Literature of the Hopi by Hattie Green Lockett, written in 1933. In government, the village is the unit, and a genuinely democratic government it is. There is a house chief, a kiva chief, a war chief, the speaker chief or town crier, and the chiefs of the clans who are likewise chiefs of the fraternities, all these making up a council which rules the pueblo, the crier publishing its decisions. Laws are traditional and unwritten. Infractions are so few that it would be hard to say what the penalties are, probably ridicule and ostracism. Theft is almost unheard of, and the taking of life by force or law is unknown. To a visitor encamped at bedtime below the mesa, the experience of hearing the speaker chief or town crier for the first time is something long to be remembered. Out of the stillness of the desert night comes a voice from the housetops, and such a voice! From the heights above it resounds in a sonorous, long-drawn chant. Everyone listens breathlessly to the important message, and it goes on and on. The writer recalls that when first she heard it 20 years ago, she sat up in bed and, rousing the camp with stage whispers, afraid to speak aloud, demanded, "Do you hear that? What on earth can it mean? Surely something awful has happened." On and on it went, endlessly. She has since been told that it is all repeated 3 times, and not until morning was it learned that the long speech had been merely the announcement of a rabbit hunt for the next day. The oldest traditions of the Hopi tell of this speaker chief and his important utterances. He is a vocal bulletin board and the local newspaper, but his news is principally of a religious nature, such as the announcement of ceremonials. This usually occurs in the evening, when all have gotten in from the fields or home from the day's journey, but occasionally announcements are made at other hours. The following is a poetic, formal announcement of the new fire ceremony, as given at sunrise from the housetop of the crier at Walpi. All people awake, open your eyes, arise. Become children of light, vigorous, active, sprightly. Hasten, clouds, from the 4 world quarters. Come, snow, in plenty, that water may abound when summer appears. Come, ice, and cover the fields, that after planting they may yield abundantly. Let all hearts be glad. The Wu-Wuchimtu will assemble in 4 days. They will encircle the villages, dancing and singing. Let the women be ready to pour water upon them, that moisture may come in plenty, and all shall rejoice. A paper published in 2017 by Nature Communications, Archaeogenomic Evidence Reveals Prehistoric Matrilineal Dynasty, studied Pueblo Bonito in the Great Chaco Canyon complex of New Mexico. Empty now, the 800 rooms of Pueblo Bonito housed perhaps 1,000 people and stood as a great center of ancestral Puebloan culture between its construction beginning in 828 CE and progressing through several stages until its abandonment in 1126. Theirs was known as Chacoan society. Most human remains that have been found here are among mounds of domestic debris. But a small crypt in a high-status house is different. It revealed layered burials of 12 different internments over time. The lowest layer was a burial crypt, holding the skeleton of a man in his 40s who had died of a fatal blow to his head, adorned with thousands of beads that had been strung into pendants, necklaces, anklets, and bracelets made primarily of turquoise and shell. His is the single richest tomb ever found in the American Southwest. Other treasures in the crypt are mother-of-pearl abalone shells from the Pacific coast and a conch shell trumpet. This crypt was covered in a layer of clean sand, and sometime later, a second body was deposited atop it, also containing a profusion of turquoise treasures. His body was in turn eventually covered by a type of plank floor seen nowhere else in the settlement, and atop it were found the remains of 12 more individuals, their bones disarticulated and commingled, indicating that, quote, the bodies of deceased members of this elite lineage were periodically added to the small dark room. These 12 interments were directly associated with offerings of ceramic bowls and pitchers and, in some instances, shell and turquoise. Nearby were caches of flutes in the northeastern corner and carved wooden ceremonial staffs in the ceiling. Turquoise beads were placed around wooden posts in the room corners, a pattern consistent with ethnographic accounts of Puebloan cosmology. Also noteworthy were the multiple caches of ritually important objects in adjacent rooms, hundreds of wooden ceremonial staffs, scores of cylindrical ceramic vessels, the remains of scarlet macaws, and jewelry. The researchers used archaeogenomic methods to demonstrate that of the 9 successful genetic samples they were able to derive from the remains, all possessed identical mitochondrial genomes. Nuclear genome data confirms that these individuals demonstrated mother-daughter and grandmother-grandson relationships consistent with matrilineal descent in this elite lineage. Together, these results indicate that hereditary inequality and societal complexity emerged in Chaco by the early 9th century CE, and that this matrilineal dynasty persisted at the center of this complex society for nearly 330 years until its rapid collapse in the early 12th century CE. Matrilineal descent has been noted among many of the modern Pueblo, but certainly not all. Apart from the Jemes, the Tanoan-speaking Pueblo peoples practice patrilineal kinship instead, with children being born into the father's clan. In fact, they share a distinct set of cultural differences between the villages that practice matrilineal kinship, marrying within the clan, endogamy, instead of looking for partners without, exogamy. They build kivas in different ways than the matrilineal villages and use them for different purposes. They have different creation myths as well, speaking of an origin under the sea or across the water instead of crawling up from underground. And they possess distinct cultural practices such as which numbers are magical or significant, separate counting systems, and astronomical interpretations. Here's what Hattie Green Lockett had to say about the matrilineal Hopi of 1933 on the far side of the Pueblo lands from the vanished Chacoans. Making up the village are various clans. A clan comprises all the descendants of a traditional maternal ancestor. Children belong to the clan of the mother. These clans bear the name of something in nature, often suggested by either a simple or a significant incident in the legendary history of the people during migration, when offshoots from older clans were formed into new clans. Thus, a migration legend accounts for the name of the Bear Clan, the Bluebird Clan, the Spider Clan, and others. Sons and daughters are expected to marry outside the clan, and the son must live with his wife's people, so does nothing to perpetuate his own clan. The Hopi is monogamous. A daughter on marrying brings her husband to her home, later building the new home adjacent to that of her mother. Therefore, many daughters born to a clan means increase in population. Some clans have indeed become nearly extinct because of the lack of daughters, the sons having naturally gone to live with neighboring clans, or in some cases with neighboring tribes. As a result, some large houses are pointed out that have many unoccupied and even abandoned rooms. The clan is dying out. Possibly there may be a good many men of that clan living, but they are not with or near their parents and grandparents. They are now a part of the clan into which they have married, and must live there, be it near or far. Why should they keep up such a practice when possibly the young man could do better, economically and otherwise, in his ancestral home and community? The answer is, it has always been that way, and that seems to be reason enough for a Hopi. Religion. The mythical landscape and religious traditions of the ancestral Puebloans are subjects so vast it would take multiple episodes to discuss them. Perhaps because of the continuous age of many of their cultural traditions, perhaps due to their position as a foundational culture in the region, the religion and mythology traditions of the modern Pueblo peoples have been studied by academics for generations and have been used and misused in popular culture for nearly as long. The Kachina dolls and pictographs painted on sandstone sold in tourist shops, and the vast and unsupported conspiracy theories that have sprung from some of their most sacred stories make clear how powerful these stories are, even when they are woefully misunderstood. One of the first ethnologists to study the Hopi, Alexander M. Stephen, came to the reluctant conclusion that Hopi ceremonialism was so abstract that it would take longer than a man's lifetime to understand it, and that it requires a sixth sense of Hopi culture. Whether Hopi or Chocowin or Zuni, ancestral Puebloans centered their religious practices and cosmology in the kiva. Ancient sites would average 1 kiva per 15 to 50 dwellings. They come in many variations, but they are usually a sunken or semi-sunken pit with the entrance in the roof. Early kivas were simple holes in the sandstone, but later developments added adobe bricks, hearths, windscreens, and the crucial sipapu, or hole to the underworld, from which all humans are believed to have originated. The proto-kivas of Mesa Verde are the earliest discovered. Beginning in the 9th century CE, they are square, no more than 1 meter deep, and a few meters across. By the middle of the 10th century, they had transformed into deeper, larger, circular structures. Some kivas became truly gigantic. In the Great Kiva in Aztec Ruins National Park, 4 massive pillars of alternating masonry and horizontal poles held up the ceiling beams, which in turn supported an estimated 95-ton roof. Each pillar rested on 4 shaped stone discs, weighing about 161 kilograms apiece. These discs are of limestone, which came from mountains at least 60 kilometers away. It is impossible to overstate the importance of the kiva in the daily lives and culture of the ancestral Puebloans. They possessed practical, ritual, and powerfully mystical significance. To the peoples who built them, these kivas are located along lines of energy that run through the land. The kivas tap into these networks, allowing its occupants to access that energy, and also open gateways to an incredible variety of other worlds, dimensions, and time periods. Their descendants assert that communication between kivas is possible, and that this is one of the ways they've been able to sustain their far-flung culture for millennia. In kivas, it is believed that one can commune with one's ancestors, go back or forward in time, visit with ghosts and spirits, contact a variety of other dimensions, planes, and planets, and, most importantly perhaps, have access to the underworld of their past. The creation myths of the ancestral Puebloans share many important elements. The Zuni call their creator Awonawilona, who created the world and all living things from the void. Awonawilona is a divine spirit with no human form or attributes, is considered to embody both genders, and is never personified in Zuni folklore. To the Hopi, this is Tawa, the sun spirit, who formed the first world out of Tokpela, or endless space, as well as its original inhabitants. In broad terms, both of these religious traditions describe a first world where humans originated deep underground. In some stories, we began no better than insects. In others, we are already fully formed humans. But in all versions, we are terribly unhappy and uncomfortable down in the dark. Each culture has different names for the hero or heroes or gods who led the first people out of the first world up into the second. In many versions of the story, they climb up a ladder reminiscent of their Pueblo ladders. In others, they climb trees or stalks up to the next level, known by the Zuni as the Moss World, Ka'olin Tehuli. There the unhappy travelers transformed into the creatures of that wilderness world, wolves and bears. But still living underground, the changes did not ease their misery. So they climbed up to a third world. According to the Hopi, this was achieved with the help of the deity known as Spider Grandmother, who is a figure found among many southwestern folklore traditions. She lives in a hole like a kiva and comes out to help people with her wisdom, guidance, and resourcefulness. Upon reaching the third world, the people achieved their present human shape and gained the benefits of weaving, pottery, and fire. But there they became evil, at least in certain accounts, and Tawa cleansed the third world with a great flood. Only the good survived, and they were washed onto an ancient shore of the fourth world, the daylight world, where we all live. This appears to be one of the oldest versions of the tale, but others have it that a great hollow bamboo or sapling was planted in the third world that grew up to finally break through the ground we know. The location of that breakthrough is believed to be through the deepest geographical point they knew, the floor of the Grand Canyon. The mythology of ancestral Puebloans can't be described without focusing on the pictographs, petroglyphs, and symbols which fill the landscape. Along with sacred images of the animals and plants of their lives, such as bear and antelope and amaranth, these petroglyphs could also serve as waymarkers and even astronomical notations marking the position of the sun during the summer equinox. And the important aspect of these symbols is that they could often be all of these things at the same time. Cosmology played a large role in the religious and cultural lives of the ancestral Puebloans, and their complex festival and ceremonial schedule, with certain ceremonies lasting all years, charted the cycles and rhythms of not only the flora and fauna around them, but also the sky. It has been very tempting for outsiders to appropriate the ideas and traditions of the modern Pueblo people into their own belief systems. Knowing that certain versions of the creation myth depict the original humans as lizard people living underground is probably all that needs to be said on the subject of cultural appropriation. But that is not the only aspect of their mythology that has been superficially cherry-picked by outsiders. Much of their integrative thought, which is supported by generations of commitment to the nature-based principles of their cultures, including their cosmology, their connection to the world around them, and their moral code, are things that we admire, but without the proper background and context, can often misuse. Transitions. The Great Age of the Ancestral Puebloans didn't begin until about 700 CE. During this time, the Colorado Plateau became more mild, temperate, and wet. Populations that had long been nomadic settled down for the first time, and many of these developments took root. The first settlements built the first proto-kivas, and agriculture brought stability to precarious lifestyles. According to the Picos classification, after the Basket Maker III era ended in the 8th century, the first of 5 Pueblo eras began. The Pueblo I period starts with a massive population boom on the plateau, as much as a 10-fold increase over just a few generations. Also, human remains indicate that it was a time of increased fertility and decreased mortality, which may have led to the invention and adaptation of many quality-of-life improvements. Imagine, if you will, living at the dawn of such a new era. Would they have had a greater optimism than their ancestors did, now that life is easier, the winters have relented, and food is abundant? Is there perhaps a brief period of generational celebration, or even relief, that you've survived the worst the world has to offer? Or perhaps they were like so many other cultures, always pining for the nostalgic days of hunting Paleolithic megafauna such as ancient reindeer and woolly mammoths and glyptodonts. A wattle and daub type of construction proliferated at the beginning of Pueblo I called jacal. Using close-set poles packed with mud, the first pueblos were modest affairs. This was improved upon over time with the use of stone slab foundations and adobe clay instead of mud. These adobe houses with thatch roofs were soon connected together into the first true pueblos. Archaeologist J. Richard Ambler noted, "The change in village layout would seem to reflect a basic change in village social organization from a loosely integrated group of related families to a tightly integrated group, and also a change in ceremonial organization from a largely shamanistic and individualistic orientation to communal ceremonies organized around the calendrical round." The villages increased in size from an average of 5 to 10 structures per village during the previous Basket Maker era to 20 to 30. Some grew even larger, and for good reason. A Piedra village in the San Juan River Valley of New Mexico from this period has been excavated, revealing palisades or defensive walls ringing the town. Samples from the site indicate this was during a drought, so the prevailing hypothesis is that the village was raided for food, and they made efforts to defend themselves by building fortifications. This isn't the only place such structures are seen. And in yet other locales, Ancestral Puebloans used natural features such as narrow canyons or high caves in cliff walls or the tops of mesas to provide for their defense. Near the end of Pueblo I, a drought hit the region for nearly 50 years, increasing their reliance on organized irrigation and initiating the widespread adoption of agriculture. These pressures led to the development of many new practices in Pueblo II, including the construction of towers and dams for conserving water and the documented practice of crafting villages, trading their specialized pottery with farming villages for regular allotments of maize. By 1075 CE, the first second-story structures are built, using a construction technique called double-coursed masonry. The Pueblos flourished. This period is the golden age of the Ancestral Puebloans. In Chaco Canyon, in Mesa Verde, and across the entire plateau, they were the dominant culture, enjoying a time of relative abundance and peace. Walnut Canyon, just to the east of Flagstaff, Arizona, is a deep, hidden maze that housed a population of Ancestral Puebloans the Spaniards referred to as the Sin Agua, meaning without water. These people had not only survived the harsh deserts of northern Arizona, they had thrived. It is theorized that perhaps pressure from expanding nations and tribes to the northeast on the Great Plains may have led the Ancestral Puebloans to move more fully into the Colorado Plateau in the 8th century. Walnut Canyon, which had been inhabited seasonally for thousands of years by archaic natives, finally hosted permanent residents at the beginning of Pueblo I. These were farmers who built one-room pit houses beside their fields. They grew maize and other crops with dry farming techniques and prospered. In Pueblo II, around 1100 CE, the Sinagua began to build cliff dwellings. Whether this was for protection from floods or wild animals or defense from invaders is unknown. Carving out natural recesses in the limestone walls, they stacked layers of stone before the openings and secured them with mud, then clay. Walnut Canyon became the center for a new regional power, with related settlements ranging to the nearby mountains and valleys. By the beginning of the 13th century, the civilization was in full flower. Trade networks connected the ancestral Puebloans with far-flung regions, including turquoise, originally from Santa Fe, ornamental seashells from the Gulf of Mexico, and more macaw feathers from Mexico. Then, suddenly, Walnut Canyon emptied. In 1250 CE, at nearly the same time as the abandonment of Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde, the Pueblo II era came to a close. The occupants of the canyon initially moved a few miles southeast, then were most likely assimilated by the Hopi to the north. To the modern Hopi, these people were a part of the Hisatsinom, the people of long ago, who were returning from a scattered diaspora, answering a call for all the ancient clans to come together. Why this call might have occurred, or whether it occurred at all, is a subject of great debate both inside modern Pueblo cultures and in academic institutions. Other reasons for this migration, supported in the archaeological record, point to the Great Drought, a dry period in the Americas from 1100 CE to 1350 CE that also collapsed the Cahokia Mississippian civilization and the Tiwanaku civilization of Bolivia. Also, Numic-speaking peoples from the north and east made serious forays into the Colorado Plateau, perhaps destabilizing trade networks and putting the civilization on a war footing. Or perhaps it was topsoil erosion, or deforestation, or pressure from the Mesoamerican cultures to the south. It is likely that in such a huge and varied region over several hundred years, it was all these reasons and more. What came after were several more high points for Pueblo culture. The pottery for which they are so justifiably known reached its finest expression in later centuries. Kachina culture, which is a further refinement of modern Pueblo religion and ceremony, did not develop until Pueblo III. The Navajo arrived, then the Spaniards. The eras came and went, these recent times not the focus of this channel. But unlike the vast majority of the subjects we study here, the ancient peoples of the Colorado Plateau have not vanished. They are still here, in their thousands, in their 100 villages, keeping alive these traditions that stretch back to the Paleolithic. If you're interested in learning more about what passed in the following centuries for the Pueblo people, I implore you to seek out members of their tribes and councils who are willing to talk to outsiders. Let them tell their own stories in their own words, since those stories have been stolen and misused by others for so long. And as one last reminder that the Pueblo people are still here and are not forgotten, the first Native American cabinet member in United States history is Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland, an enrolled member of Laguna Pueblo.